And giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity. Save our souls, O good one. Amen. So we're nearing the end, and I had a question for everybody that I'd like you to think about. We've got, of course, everybody has a little more time than I think we planned on. So what I would propose is trying to read through at home. Each one of you read through the rest of the ladder, and then just bring questions for discussion. What do you think? Okay. Is that positive, everybody? Okay. Very good. So a lot of this this part of the ladder is kind of wisdom sayings. You know, some of it is very specifically to the topic, but especially in relation to discernment, it's basically sharing his wisdom. Now, if we look at the rest of the ladder, discernment on stillness, and then on prayer, dispassion, hope, and love. This is really about the apex of the virtues, and this is of course something that we can aspire to, but it's the goal for which we're reaching. So we should try and really, try and take to heart what he's saying. You know, some of the battles that were previously discussed with the passions are much more difficult, and really it is a ladder, and we gain more, and it's a ladder of gaining self-control over the course of years and years of spiritual practice. Here again, it's not something that can be done quickly, but something rather that we have to take according to the according to our ability at the time. And it's so easy to fall into some kind of pride or vainglory, and to think that we've attained more than we have, and that we've gone farther than we actually have. So, but anyway, with that, let's get to discernment. So, you want to read? Okay, David.
Step 26 on discernment of thoughts, passions, and virtues. Number 1, discernment in beginners is true knowledge of themselves.
This is, we've gone through that. We're at on 39.
39?
Number 39 of step 26.
Okay. Certain people asked me a question difficult to solve and which is beyond the powers of anyone like me, and is not to be found in any of the books that have reached me. For they said, what are the particular offspring of the 8 deadly sins? Or which of the 3 chief sins is the father of the other 5 minor sins? But by pleading praiseworthy ignorance as regards this difficulty, I learned from the holy men the following. The mother of lust is gluttony, and the mother of despondency is vainglory. Sorrow and also anger are the offspring of those 3, i.e., cupidity, sensuality, ambition, and the mother of pride is vainglory.
Okay, we'll just keep going.
Okay. In reply to this statement of those ever memorable fathers, I began again earnestly to ask them to tell me about the pedigree of the 8 sins, which exactly are born from which And these dispassionate men kindly instructed me, saying, the irrational passions have no order or reason, but they have every sort of disorder and every kind of chaos. And the Blessed Fathers confirmed this by convincing examples and supplied many proofs, some of which we are including in the present chapter in order to draw light from them in judging the rest. The sort of thing I mean is this: untimely jesting is sometimes born of lust, and sometimes of vainglory, when a man impiously puts on a pious air, and sometimes too of luxury. Much sleep is born sometimes of luxury, and sometimes of fasting, when those who fast are proud of it, and sometimes of despondency, and sometimes from nature. 43. Talkativeness is born sometimes of gluttony and sometimes of vainglory. 44. Despondency is born sometimes of luxury and sometimes of lack of fear of God. 45. Blasphemy is properly the offspring of pride, but is often born of condemnation of our neighbor for the same thing, or of the untimely envy of the demons. 46. Hardness of heart sometimes comes from overeating, often from coldness and detachment, and again attachment comes from lust, or from avarice, or from gluttony, or from vainglory, and from many other causes. 47. Malice is born of conceit and anger. 48. Hypocrisy comes from self-satisfaction and willfulness. 49. All the contrary virtues are born of parents contrary to these, but without enlarging on the subject, for I should not have time if I were to inquire into them all one by one, I will merely say that for all the passions mentioned above, the remedy is humility. Those who have obtained that virtue have won the whole fight. Shall I continue, Vladika?
Yeah, please go.
50. The mother of all the vices is pleasure and malice. He who has them within him will not see the Lord, and abstinence from the first will bring but little benefit without abstinence from the second. 51. As an example of the fear of the Lord, let us take the fear that we feel in the presence of rulers and wild beasts, and as an example of desire for God, let carnal love serve as a model for you. There is nothing against taking examples of the virtues from what is contrary. 52. The present generation is seriously corrupt and all full of pride and hypocrisy. In bodily labors, it perhaps reaches the level of our ancient fathers, but it is not graced with their gifts. Though I think nature never had such need of spiritual gifts as now, and we have got what we deserve. For God is manifested not in labors, but in simplicity and humility. And if the power of the Lord is made perfect in weakness, the Lord will certainly not reject a humble worker. 53. When we see one of our athletes in Christ bodily suffering and infirmity, let us not maliciously seek to learn the explanation of his illness, but rather with simple and genuine love, let us try to heal him as though he were part of our own body, and as a fellow warrior wounded in the fray. 54. Sickness is sometimes for the cleansing of sins, and sometimes to humble our mind. 55. When our good and all-gracious Lord and Master sees people too lazy in their exercises, he lays their flesh low with sickness, an exercise that gives them no labor, and sometimes it also cleanses the soul from evil thoughts or passions. 56. All that happens to us, seen or unseen, can be taken by us in a good or a passionate or some middle disposition. I saw 3 brethren punished. One was angry, one suppressed his grief, but the third reaped the fruit of great joy. 57. I have seen farmers who were casting the same seeds on the earth. yet each had his own special intention. One was thinking of paying his debts. Another wanted to get rich. Another wished to honor the Lord with his gifts. Another's aim was to get praise for his good work from the passers-by on the way of life. Another desired to annoy his neighbor who was envious of him. And another did not want to be reproached by people for idleness. Here are the names of those seeds cast to the earth by the farmers: fasting, vigil, alms, services, and the like. Let our brethren in the Lord carefully test their intentions. Would someone else like to read? Just to mix it up, or shall I continue?
Well, let's take a break for a second. And does anybody have any questions? You can either ask the question, you have to unmute yourself, or you can write it in the chat. The connection between talkative and gluttony in number 43. Talkative, 43, talkativeness is born sometimes of gluttony and sometimes of vainglory. Well, vainglory is pretty obvious. But I wonder if what he's referring to is the desire for essentially fellowship during a meal, and the talkativeness and the vainglory go together. That's my guess. Anyone else?
Well, just speaking from experience from visiting Jordanville, where the meals were in silence in the trapeza, I learned some valuable lessons there. That, as a contrast to having a meal in the parish, we as sinners, sometimes when we gather together and with good intention for fellowship, sometimes just by our nature, usually one stands above the rest in terms of social dominance and being the comedian of the group. Yes, jest coming out from lust. I think that's an interesting observation that St. John of Glenelg made.
Mm-hmm. All of these bear thinking about. And I think part of that is to examine our own actions and to see, what are the sources of some of our habits. So.
I had a question, Vladika.
Number 54. Sickness is sometimes for the cleansing of sins, and sometimes to humble our mind.
I mistyped it. I wondered, does God cause sickness?
God permits sickness.
Okay.
Illness, it's all within everything is within God's providence. Does God cause it? No. Does God cause suffering? No. But God allows suffering to happen so that we might learn something from it. And it's something that he determines that we need for our salvation, whether we understand that or not. And that's the difficult part about it, because sometimes we think all of our suffering is meaningless and has no value. But the fathers tell us that everything that happens to us is of value.
Thank you.
Ladika, this is Herman. I'm going back all the way to number 39, the very last statement that the mother of pride is vainglory. Could you offer some thoughts on that? I would have almost thought it was in reverse.
Vainglory is on the surface for the most part, whereas pride is something much deeper. It's a kind of essential attitude towards life, a basic kind of mindset of the soul. And vanity is, and vainglory are kind of the most superficial, more superficial manifestations of that same thing. It's looking to build up our ego, whereas with pride, our ego is already very well inflated.
Okay, thank you. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? David, you read well. You want to continue?
Sure. Thank you, Ladika.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 58. In drawing water from a well, we sometimes, without noticing it, bring up a frog with the water. And so in acquiring the virtues, we often get involved in the vices that are imperceptibly entwined with them. The kind of thing I mean is that gluttony is entangled with hospitality, lust with love, cunning with discernment, malice with thoughtfulness, duplicity, procrastination, laziness, contradiction, willfulness and disobedience with meekness, contempt of instruction with silence, conceit with joy, indolence with hope, harsh judgment with love again, despondency and sloth with quietness, acerbity with chastity, familiarity with humility, and behind them all, as a general salve, or rather poison, follows vainglory. 59. We should not be distressed if, in asking the Lord for something, we remain for a time unheard. It would have pleased the Lord if all men in a single moment had become dispassionate. Only his foresight told him that this would not be for their good. 60. All who ask and do not obtain the requests from God are denied for one of the following reasons: either because they ask at the wrong time, or because they ask unworthily and vaingloriously, or because if they received they would become conceited, or finally, because they would become negligent after obtaining their request. 61. No one, I think, would doubt that the demons and passions leave their soul either for a time or entirely, but few know the reasons why they go away from us. 62. Some of the faithful, and even of the unfaithful, have been deserted by the passions, all except one, and that one has been left as a paramount evil which fully takes the place of all the others, for it is so harmful that it can even cast down from heaven. 63. The spent material of the passions is destroyed by the divine fire. And while this material is being uprooted and the soul purified, the passions all retire. That is, if the man himself does not attract them again by worldly habits and indolence. 64. Demons leave us of their own accord so as to lead us to carelessness, and then suddenly carry off our wretched soul. 65. I know another way in which those beasts slink off. They go after the soul has thoroughly acquired the habits of vice and is its own betrayer and enemy. Infants are an example of what has been said, for when weaned from their mother's breasts, from long-standing habit they suck their fingers. 66. I know of a fifth kind of spiritual dispassion, which comes from great simplicity and praiseworthy innocence. For on such people help is justly bestowed by God, who saves the true of heart, and imperceptibly rids them of all vice, just as infants, when undressed, are quite unaware of it. 67. Vice or passion is not originally planted in nature, for God is not the creator of passions, but there are in us many natural virtues from him, among which are certainly the following: mercy, for even the pagans are compassionate; love, for even dumb animals often weep at the loss of one another; faith, for we all give birth to it of ourselves; hope, for we lend and sail and sow, hoping for the best. So, if, as has been shown, love is a natural virtue in us, and is the bond and fulfillment of the law, then it follows that the virtues are not far from nature, and those who plead their inability to practice them ought to be ashamed. Shall I continue?
Sure.
68. Above nature are chastity, freedom from anger, humility, prayer, vigil, fasting, constant compunction. Some of them men teach us, others angels, and of others the teacher and giver is God, the Word himself. 69. When confronted by evils, we should choose the least. For instance, it often happens that we are standing at prayer and brothers come to us, and we have to do one of two things: either to stop praying or to grieve the brother by leaving him without an answer. Love is greater than prayer, because prayer is a particular virtue, but love embraces all the virtues. 70. Once long ago, when I was still young, I came to a town or village, and while sitting at a table, I was attacked by thoughts of gluttony and vainglory, both at once. Fearing the offspring of gluttony, I decided that it was better to yield to vainglory, for I knew that in the young, the demon of gluttony often conquers the demon of vainglory. And this is not surprising. In people of the world, the root of all evil is love of money, but in monks, it is gluttony. Shall we pause there for a moment and discuss?
Yeah. Anybody have any questions? No questions? A lot of this is basically, fruit for meditation. To read it thoughtfully, prayerfully. So.
A lot of these I think I might have to read several times.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Yes, I usually read this quite slowly. In fact, I'm still stuck on step 1, renounce the world.
Uh-huh. I know that one.
Yes. Okay, number 71.
Mm-hmm.
Often divine providence leaves certain slight passions in spiritual people, so that by unsparingly condemning themselves for those trifling and venial defects, they may obtain that wealth of humility which none can steal. 72. It is impossible for those who have not first lived in obedience to obtain humility. For everyone who has learned an art or his own fancies himself. 73. The fathers state that the active life consists in two virtues of the most general kind, in fasting and obedience, and rightly, for the first destroys sensuality, and the other reinforces this destruction with humility. That is why mourning also has a double power, for it destroys sin and produces humility. 74. To the pious, it is natural to give everyone who asks, and to the more pious to give even to him who does not ask. But not to demand a thing back from the person who took it, especially when they have the chance, is characteristic perhaps only of the dispassionate. 75. In every passion, and also in the virtues, let us critically examine ourselves. Where are we? At the beginning, or in the middle, or at the end? 76. All the attacks which we suffer from the demons come from these three causes: from sensuality, or from pride, or from the envy of the demons. The last are blessed, the middle are very pitiful, but the first are failures till the end. 77. There is a certain feeling, or rather habit, called endurance of hardship. He who possesses it will never feel pain, labor, or hardship, or turn aside from such. Upheld by this glorious grace, the souls of the martyrs recklessly despise their tortures. 78. The guarding of the thoughts is one thing, and the custody of the mind is another. As far as the east is from the west, so much lighter is the latter than the former, even if it is more laborious. Vladika, would you care to expand and perhaps elaborate on 78?
Yeah, guarding of thoughts is to basically to keep watch over our thoughts and to not let in any kind of negative or passionate thoughts to prevent us from reacting to any kind of provocations of thoughts, so that we don't go down the merry road to the passions. Custody of the mind, however, is the goal of that. And that goal means to be able to preserve one's nous, one's awareness, in a state of no thought, to be able to be completely focused, to maintain one's attention completely on God, and to not be distracted by the passions or the thoughts that come in, the afflictive thoughts, the logismi, in any way. So, of course, we have to start out with guarding our thoughts, so that, and as we do, of course, we're going to be watching that, all of the, as one author calls it, all the inner videos that are playing from all sorts of different, with all sorts of different content and sources. Whereas once we get to the much higher custody of the mind, we've learned how to transcend those thoughts and to have a kind of inner perspective on the thoughts, and realize that they're just on the kind of shell, whereas our perspective now is something, our focused awareness is much deeper. Does that make sense?
Yes, you're speaking of the nous, the Greek nous, N-O-U-S,
right?
Correct? Okay.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not the hangman nous.
Yes. Yes. I think it's especially important now to have the guarding of thoughts, especially as many of us are working from home and we have, at least for me, have some idle time. And when you have idle time, there's room for idle thoughts. And when there's room for idle thoughts, so that's where the other passions come in. So thank you for explaining that.
Ladika, this is Herman again.
Uh-huh.
Would you be able to say a few thoughts on number 75 in terms of how we're able to examine ourselves effectively?
Well, what we're looking for is to what degree have we conquered the passion, and to what degree has it conquered us? In other words, when we get a passionate thought of one kind or another, how do we react to it? Do we immediately follow it all the way to the end and gratify ourselves one way or another, or can we let it go? Or can we, even if it takes some battle, but still let it go? Or are we in that stage of guarding the mind, or having custody of our mind, in which we just let those thoughts fly by as if they were birds outside the window? As Father Dunstan, this elder that I knew in Northern California, said, just because the birds fly by outside the window doesn't mean you have to catch them and reach out and catch them. How often are we doing that? And so in regards to the virtues, we also can look and see to what extent have we obtained those virtues, to what extent do we exercise them and live according to them. Have we attained dispassion? Have we obtained self-mastery? Have we obtained love for our neighbor? All of those things.
Wonderful. Thank you very much again.
Uh-huh.
Hi, Vladika. This is Lori.
Hi.
Hi. So with these thoughts, where does the sin take place?
The sin takes place, there's a whole progression of thoughts. First comes the provocation. It's some kind of random thought that goes through our mind. It can have its source in something we see or hear, or something we read, something we see on TV, a memory, any of those kinds of sources. And we don't necessarily have any control over those. But then our mind begins to turn it over and to play with it and to decide whether we're going to engage with it. Now, if we do that, we're already, in reality, to a great extent, we have already given ourselves over to it. And if we start, and if we decide to start examining the thought and to play with it and to feed into it, in other words, to let it catch our imagination. And so we start imagining, well, what would it be like to have, being in the middle of Lent, what would it be like to have a McDonald's hamburger? Or what would it be like to have sex with such and such a person, or whatever? And the more that we play with it, the more it keys off our reactions, our physical reactions, our emotional reactions. And pretty soon, if we have a habitual reaction to that kind of a thought, which is what a passion is, then basically it's a short circuit from that into somehow carrying out that suggestion, that provocation. And in that already there is a level of sin. Obviously the sin isn't fulfilled unless it's done, with the exception of things like hatred, resentment, anger, bitterness that don't go beyond us, but still completely upset our soul. But there is culpability, the fathers say, if we choose to indulge ourselves in some passionate thought that is going to be that we know is going to lead us down the road to some kind of gratification.
So then, yes, thank you. So prayer would be the best weapon against thoughts?
Yeah. You know, to remember God, to let the remembrance of God fill our mind and our heart, and to simply let go of the thought. Recognize it as a temptation and just dismiss it. Of course, that's easier said than done.
Right. Thank you, Vladika.
Okay. 79. It is one thing to pray for deliverance from bad thoughts, another to contradict them, another to despise and disregard them. Of the first way he bears testimony who said, "O God, come to my help." Of the second, he who said, "And to those who reproach me I will make contradictory answer." And again, "Thou hast made us a contradiction to our neighbors." Of the third is the witness of the psalmist, "I was dumb, and opened not my mouth, and I put a bridle on my mouth, and when the sinner was before me," and again, "The proud have broken the law to excess, but I have not swerved from thy contemplation." He who stands on the middle step will often make use of the first of these means through being taken unawares. But he who stands on the first step is not in a position to ward off his enemies by the second means, but he who has reached the third step spurns the demons altogether.
Okay, is that clear to everybody?
Not quite.
No?
Me, no.
Okay. So the first way of guarding our thoughts, of guarding our mind, and seeking deliverance from bad thoughts, is to pray about it. Second is to contradict them, and the third is essentially to let them just pass by and refuse to notice them. Evagrius has a whole treatise, which is now in English, of scriptural quotes that are used to contradict various passionate thoughts. So it's a couple hundred pages, actually, of quotations that come in handy when various thoughts occur. This is useful. But of course, it's not as useful as it is to simply disregard the thought and not even pay attention to it. And if you engage in battle with the thought and start praying against it or the demon that is behind it, which is the lowest level, actually, it's going to be, you're facing an uphill battle. Does this make sense?
Yes, I think so, Vladika, yes. Number 80. Naturally, it is impossible for a bodiless being to be confined by a body, but for a person who has God, everything is possible. 81. Just as those who sense the smell, whose sense of smell is healthy can tell who has hidden perfumes, so the pure soul can recognize in others both the fragrance which he himself has obtained from God and the stench from which he has been freed, though this is imperceptible to others. 82. It is impossible for all to become dispassionate, but it is not impossible for all to be saved and reconciled to God. 83. Take care that you are not mastered by foreigners, those thoughts which urge you to be inquisitive about the ineffable judgments of divine providence, or the visions that people have which secretly suggest that the Lord is partial. For they are the offspring of self-esteem and are known as such. 84. There is a demon of avarice which often apes humility, and there is a demon of vainglory, and one of sensuality too, which both urge to almsgiving. However, if we are clear of them both, we should not stint our acts of mercy wherever we are. 85. Some have said that demons work against demons, but I know that they all seek our destruction. 86. Our own strong desire and intention, with God's cooperation, precede every spiritual action, both visible and mental. For if the last has not paved the way, the second is apt not to follow. If there is a time for everything under heaven, as the preacher says, and by the word everything, must be understood what concerns our holy life, then if you please, let us look into it, and let us seek to do at each time what is proper for that occasion. For it is certain that those who enter the list there is a time for dispassion. And I say this for the combatants who are serving their apprenticeship. There is a time for tears, and a time for hardness of heart. There is a time for obedience, and there is a time to command. There is a time to fast, and a time to partake. There is a time for battle with our enemy, the body, and a time when the fire is dead, a time of spiritual storm, and a time of spiritual calm, a time for heartfelt sorrow, and a time for spiritual joy, a time for teaching, and a time for listening, a time of pollutions, perhaps on account of conceit, and a time of cleansing by humility, a time for struggle, and a time for safe relaxation, a time for quiet, and a time for undistracted distraction, a time for unceasing prayer, and a time for sincere service. So let us not be deceived by proud zeal and seek prematurely what will come in its own good time. That is, we should not seek in winter what comes in summer, or at seed time what comes at harvest, because there is a time to sow labors and a time to reap the unspeakable gifts of grace. Otherwise, we shall not receive even in season what is proper to that season. Vladika, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Given this time of pandemic and uncertainty, what do you think that this time is for us?
I think it's a time for repentance. I think it's a time for us to turn away from our selfishness and from our overindulgence in sensuality and perversity, and turn back to God. It's a time to turn away from the slaughter of the innocents, and to repent as a nation, as a people, and turn back to God, and a time to turn away from the atheism and materialism and the general rebellion against God, which our culture has fallen into. Because certainly these things merit God's wrath.
Thank you, Vladika.
So it's a time for cleansing, it's a time for humility, it's a time for repentance, it's a time for stillness, and it's a time for unceasing prayer. But mostly it's a time of repentance and turning to God.
Yes, it seems as if God is admonishing us to retreat to ourselves, if you will.
God and the governors. So, anybody? Oh, Andrew has a question. It was suggested to me once that I am not responsible for my initial thought or feeling, but that I am responsible for my reactions. This suggested to me that God willed me to have the thoughts as part of his divine plan. How do we discern God's will for us in these thoughts that can at times lead to sin? Because they elicit strong temptations and reactions, it is a struggle, especially at times of spiritual weakness and fasting. Well, certainly everything is within God's plan, everything is within God's providence. But to say that God willed us to have evil thoughts, I think is not the case. He allows us to have the evil thoughts, which try us and make us struggle for our faith and struggle to purify our minds and our hearts. But God doesn't will for us to have sinful thoughts. We're not responsible for the provocation, the initial thought, but we are responsible for what we do with it and how we react to it. In other words, our reaction. So that part is correct. It's also very important, and one of our biggest problems is that we try and discern God's will through our thoughts. In other words, we take ourselves way too seriously and think that our thoughts are some kind of revelation of God's will to us. And the reality is they're not. Our thoughts are usually a revelation of the things that we have preoccupied ourselves with, of things we've seen, things we've heard, things we've read, things we're thinking about. And our thoughts and our imaginations and dreams come to us out of the blue. It's just like well, I like the image, going into Best Buy and looking at all those TVs, each with a different image on it, each tuned to a different channel. And that's what our stream of consciousness is like. And so we learn how to tune those out, but often not to the point where we can come to custody of our mind and tune out all of it. Because for the parts where, or for those things for which we have ingrained passionate or habitual reactions, those are the kinds of things that tempt us. And it's not God that tempts us, it's that we tempt ourselves. So if that helps, I don't know.
Vladika, it's Lori. If I can add, for me, I noticed that I used to think the same way. God gave me these thoughts. God did this to me. God. Everything was blaming on God. But I noticed somewhere by struggling, later comes strength.
Right.
Or faith, or what I thought I had strong faith at one point, and then I realized, whoa, I had nothing. And it was only through a struggle that I was able to realize this. Mm-hmm. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, I think it's right on the right track.
Thanks.
Andrew also brought up if that question could also be related to the petition in the Lord's Prayer, lead us not into temptation. It's interesting that Pope Francis, usually not somebody quoted in this class, has decided to retranslate the prayer so that it says, instead of lead us not into temptation, it's don't let us be led into temptation. Or let us not be led into temptation. Which quite frankly, theologically, I like, but the other is actually a more accurate rendering of the Greek. But the scriptures are very clear that God does not tempt us. You just look in the epistle of St. James. we're tempted by our own passions and desires. But God does allow us to be tempted. He doesn't provide the sources of the temptation, but he allows us to be tempted, so that we can purify ourselves of all of these things that, and in other words, so that we can see clearly what it is that leads us away from God, and reject it, which is part of that process of purification. Does it make sense? Okay. Anybody else? Shall we continue?
Okay. Number 88. By the ineffable providence of God, some have received holy returns for their toiling before their labors, some during their labors, some after their labors, and some at the time of their death. Is it a question of which of them was rendered more humble? 89. And this is step 26 for those that have just joined us. Step 26, number 89. There is a despair that is the consequence of a multitude of sins, of a burdened conscience and unbearable sorrow, because the soul is covered with the multitude of wounds and it sinks under the burden of them into the depth of despair. And there is another kind of sorrow that comes to us from pride and conceit, when someone considers that he has not deserved a fall that he has had. The observant will find the distinguishing feature of each. One coolly gives way to indifference. The other in despair clings to his struggle, which does not accord with his state. The former is cured by temperance and good hope, and the latter by humility and the habit of not judging anyone. 90. It should not surprise us or even seem to us strange when we see that some do bad deeds under cover of good words. For perhaps even in paradise, the snake was destroyed by overwhelming conceit. 91. In all your undertakings and in every way of life, whether you are living in obedience or are not submitting your work to anyone, whether in outward or in spiritual matters, let this be your rule and practice to ask yourself, am I really doing this in accordance with God's will? For example, when we, beginners, carry out some task and the humility acquired from this action is not added to our soul, then, in my opinion, be the matter great or small, we are not doing it according to God. For in us who are still young in the spiritual life, growth in humility is the fulfillment of the Lord's will. And for those who have reached a middle state, perhaps the test is the cessation of inner conflicts, and for the perfect, an increase and abundance of the divine light. 92. Even a small thing cannot be small to the great, but to the small, even great things are not altogether perfect. 93. When the air is cleared of clouds, the sun shines brightly, and a soul freed from its former habits and granted forgiveness has certainly seen the divine lights. 94. Sin is one thing, idleness is another, indifference another, passion another, and a fall another. He who is able to investigate this in the Lord, let him seek clearly. 95. Some praise above all the gift of miracle working and the visible spiritual gifts, not knowing that there are many higher than this which are hidden and which therefore remain secure. 96. He who is perfectly purified sees the soul of his neighbor, although not the actual substance of the soul, and can tell its state. But he who progresses further can judge the state of the soul from the body. 97. A small fire often destroys a whole forest. So too a small flaw spoils all our labor. 98. There is a rest from hostility which awakens the power of the mind without stirring the fire of passion. And there is an exhaustion of the body, which perhaps excites even movements in the flesh, so that we should not trust in ourselves, but should trust in God, who, without our knowledge, mortifies the lust living in us. 99. When we see that some love us in the Lord, then we should not allow ourselves to be especially free with them. For nothing is so likely to destroy love and produce hatred as familiarity. 100. The eye of the soul is spiritual and extremely beautiful. And next after the incorporeal beings, it surpasses all things. That is why people who are still subject to passions can often know the thoughts in the souls of others on account of their great love for them, and especially when they have not been sunk and defiled by the clay. If nothing is so opposed to a material nature as material nature, let him who reads understand. The eye of the soul, Vladika, could you expand on this eye of the soul and...
The nous.
Oh, it's the nous.
The nous. In other words, it's that noetic aspect of our being, that part of our soul that is the spiritual core of our being. And it shares the same nature as the angels, which is what makes us distinct from animals. And it's something that's certainly present in every human being. So, and I think one of the things that's very important that he brings up here is that the eye of the soul, or rather, that love is the very energy of God, and that when we have authentic love within ourselves, it's not our own natural emotion. It's not our own. It's not a thought. It's not coming from our mind. It's not coming from our brain, but rather it's authentic love is purely noetic, and it recognizes that which is noetic, and in others. In other words, it can commune on that deepest level. Ideally, that's what the bond between a husband and a wife is. It's not just the physical bond; it's that spiritual bond. It's the bond between friends, people who authentically love one another. Now, one of the incorporating. So is that clear? Is that part clear?
Yes, Vladika, thank you.
Okay. Peter asked about 99. When we see that some love us in the Lord, then we should not allow ourselves to be especially free with them, for nothing is so likely to destroy love and produce hatred as familiarity. Well, familiarity is not on the noetic level. Familiarity is on the very human level, and when we're familiar with other people, we relate through our passions, through our mind, through our emotions, through and we allow ourselves to joke and to all of that kind of thing, and we can, and that deep level of love and communion, which is on a spiritual level, can be disrupted by that, and lead to a real disappointment, even as he says, even hatred of the other person, because that person that all of a sudden that you thought was, deeply spiritual is in fact not. So anyway, does that make sense?
Bloody gets next.
Yes.
Okay.
So
Okay.
in this last passage 100, it says, "This is why people who are still subject to passions can often know the thoughts and the souls of others on account of their great love for them."
Uh-huh. In other words, they're so deeply in sync spiritually that they can know their thoughts. And this is the level of the great elders.
I don't understand. It says they're still subject to the passions.
Oh. Well,
And they know the thoughts.
okay, I misspoke. The great elders, of course, are to a great extent have achieved a great measure of dispassion, but that spiritual level of love is possible for anybody who has some level of spiritual awareness, whether they're subject to the passions or not. And all of those who are subject, even those who are the most dispassionate would still say they're subject to the passions. But what it does is that it allows us to have a real communion with other people on a deep level.
Right. So it's saying that even the spiritual fathers can be subject to the passions, but still know the thoughts and the souls of others.
Right. But also, if you have a very close friend, sometimes you can, sometimes you can even complete one another's sentences. You know what each other are talking about. You have an intuitive understanding, right?
Okay.
And that's what he's talking about.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And when he says defiled by the clay, does he mean by the earth?
No, in other words, held down by bodily passions.
I see.
Yeah. The clay is the flesh.
The clay is the flesh. Step 101, or number 101. Superstitious observances in the case of lay people are contrary to divine providence, and in the monks to spiritual knowledge. Let those who are infirm in soul recognize God's visitation from their bodily circumstances, dangers, and outward temptations. But the perfect recognize it from the presence of the Holy Spirit and an accession of the spiritual gifts. 103. There is a demon who comes to us when we are lying in bed and shoots at us evil and dirty thoughts to make us shrink from rising for prayer and taking up arms against it, and makes us fall asleep with these foul thoughts and then have foul dreams too. 104. There is an evil spirit called the Forerunner who assails us as soon as we are awake from sleep and defiles our first thought. Devote the first fruits of your day to the Lord, because the whole day will belong to whoever gets the first start. It is worth hearing what an expert told me. From my morning, he said, I know the course of the whole day. Yeah, just a quick comment on, I can personally relate to that, especially with this coronavirus pandemic. I find myself, when I wake up first thing in the morning, early in the morning, I have this urge to just unlock my iPhone and find out what's happening on Twitter and the news. So this really speaks to me.
Yep.
105. There are many ways of piety and perdition. That is why it often happens that a way that is unsuitable for one just fits another, and the intention of both is acceptable to the Lord. 106. In all the temptations that happen to us, the devils struggle to make us say or do something improper. And if they cannot do that, they stand quietly and suggest that we should offer God arrogant thanksgiving. 107. Those whose minds are on things above, after the separation of soul and body, ascend on high in two parts, but those whose minds are on things below go below. For souls separated from the body, there is no intermediate place. Of all God's creations, only the soul has its being in something else, in a body, and not in itself. And it is wonderful how it can exist outside that which it received being. 108. Pious daughters are born of pious mothers, and the mothers are born of the Lord. And it is not a bad plan to apply this rule in the contrary sense. 109. Moses, or rather God himself, forbids the coward to go out to battle lest the last spiritual error should be worse than the first bodily fall. And this is right. The eyes of our body are a light for all the bodily members, and the discernment of the divine virtues is a light for the mind.
Okay. That's about an hour, and we've come to a break. This goes on for another 16 pages, so I think we should take a break here. Are there any questions?
Yeah, Vladika.
Yeah.
It's Nick again. So is 106. So it says, in all temptations that happen to us, the devil struggle to make us do or say something improper. If they cannot do that, they stand quietly. It suggests that we should offer God arrogant thanksgiving. So what if it's just thanksgiving that you didn't do anything improper? How do we know it's arrogant thanksgiving?
It's when we boast before God.
Okay.
That's arrogant. When we claim as our own virtues something that he has given us, it's arrogant. Like the Pharisee boasting about his own virtues before God. And we can look at it and we can kind of laugh, but I think we're laughing because how often do we find ourselves doing that? So, oh God, I thank you that I'm not like that man, that sinner that he doesn't have.
Yeah, definitely came to mind.
What's that?
That definitely came to mind, but
yeah, it can be pretty convicting.
yeah.
Fladika,
Yeah.
this is Lori.
Uh-huh.
I'm confused on 101, superstitious observances in the case of lay people are contrary to divine providence.
Mm-hmm.
But that second part is what confused me, and in the case of monks, to spiritual knowledge.
Well, unfortunately, there's all sorts of superstitious observances, and especially in the old cultures. In our culture, we've pretty much been purified of what's left of the old religion, in other words, paganism. So for us, the old religion is there's Protestantism or Roman Catholic, pietistic things from Roman Catholicism and other kinds of influences. We don't have superstitions in the way that you find superstitions just in an overwhelming way among, say, peasant peoples, like Greeks, Greek peasants, Ukrainian peasants, Russian peasants. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, there's, so for example, one of the, there was an elderly couple that I knew who were very sweet and very pious, and they'd become ill. And so they got a Russian folk healer.
Mm.
And that was very odd, because this folk healer said you had to light your candles before your icons in just such a way, and you would walk around them 3 or 4 times one way, and 3 or 4 times another way, and 3 or 4 times back the other way, and do all of these strange little rituals, and basically that's paganism,
Right.
And relying on those kinds of rituals. Another thing, like very big with the Greeks, is the evil eye.
Yes.
Which is just Eastern Mediterranean, old folk religion. So it's contrary to the divine providence, because it's people who are trying to create, to control actually all of those things, and any kind of magic and any kind of all the old religions were basically about controlling nature, controlling the things that would happen. So it's contrary to God's providence. It's not accepting God's providence. It's trying to control it and manipulate it. But in monks, it's contrary to spiritual knowledge, because if a monk has, is doing these little weird pagan, old folk rituals, which are contrary to the life and the teaching of the church, he's still trying to manipulate the old gods, as it were. So how can there be any shred of spiritual knowledge there?
Okay, so for instance, at the monastery once, one of the fathers was making the tea out of the olive leaves and all kinds of herbs.
Mm-hmm.
And, they do this. And so they had brought out this big branch, this olive branch with lots of leaves on it.
Uh-huh.
And he says, sure, you can start with the tea and the leaves. And I start. And then next thing you know, these ladies, like older ladies, there was about 7 of them. All of a sudden they came to the bookstore and they all started pitching in on these leaves. And he looked at me and he says, did you see that? That was just like angels. So what he really thought was the Lord sent these women to help finish this task. And so is that a superstition, or is that a divine providence? How does that work?
I think that's basically an overly pious attempt to flatter those women.
Oh, okay.
Quite frankly.
No, that's good. That's like, I just didn't know how to view that. And it always stuck with me that he said that. And I was like, I wonder what he saw that I didn't see.
Not much.
Okay, good.
So, what else?
Adika, this is Herman.
Uh-huh.
With number 109,
Uh-huh.
who is that addressed to? If the question makes sense.
Well, Moses, or rather God himself, forbids the coward to go out to battle, lest the last spiritual error be worse than the first bodily fall. And this is right. So if somebody is truly a coward and they get pushed to go out to battle, you know, either through their own vainglory or being forced, they're going to get killed. You know, they're going to get hurt, at least, because they won't be able to function. So it's not a good idea to send a coward out to battle. Lest the last spiritual error be worse than the first bodily fall. And there'll be a bodily fall, all right, but the spiritual error would be, what would that be? Well,
I see, but there's an awareness, I guess, for ourselves.
Yeah.
In all this as well. So, okay, thank you. I understand better now.
So is that good? Anything else? Okay. Well, why don't we pray and we can stop recording. And then if we want to chat for a moment, we can. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever and into ages of ages.
Amen.
Spolati despota.
God bless you.